My name's Alex, and this whole thing went down back in '96. I was just a teenager then, working this gig as a fire lookout in some remote tower up in the Pacific Northwest. The job was pretty much what you'd expect: keep an eye out for any signs of fire, report anything weird, and stay in touch with the other towers in the base. It's the kind of job where you've got tons of time to think, a lot of time to be alone. Isolation is just part of the deal, and back then, before the internet and smartphones were really a thing, that isolation could hit you pretty hard. This story isn't about fires, though. It's about something else, something I still can't really wrap my head around. Most people don't believe me when I tell them, but it happened. I've been carrying it around with me for years now. As time went by, I figured I'd meet someone else who'd believe me, or even better, who'd gone through something similar. That hope's pretty much dried up. Still, I can't shake the feeling that I can't be the only one. Anyway, it all started during my first week up in that fire lookout tower. I'd already gotten into a rhythm, something to fill those long, empty hours. Every morning, the sun would peek through the tower's little windows, and that was my cue to start the day. I'd roll out of my creaky bed and head straight for the tiny kitchen area. I'd boil water on a little stove for my coffee. That smell, it filled up that small space and made it feel a bit more normal, a bit more like home. Then, coffee in hand, I'd climb up to the observation deck. The view from up there was, well, it was something else. Beautiful, yeah, but also kind of intimidating. The forest just stretched out forever in every direction, this huge ocean of trees. My job was to scan that vastness, looking for any hint of smoke or fire. So, I'd grab my binoculars and start my watch. I knew how important my role was. A small fire could turn into a raging inferno if it wasn't caught early. It was a heavy responsibility, but I was up for it. My radio equipment was always there, sitting on a wooden table. That was my lifeline, connecting me to the base and the other lookout towers scattered across the region. Every morning and evening, like clockwork, I'd report in. But on this particular day, that routine took a seriously unsettling turn. After I finished my first sweep of the forest, my eyes caught something that just didn't belong. Out there, at the edge of the tree line, way beyond any hiking trails, were these shadowy figures. They were just standing there, not moving, almost like they were watching the tower, or watching me. My pulse picked up. This was definitely not something they'd trained me for. I could feel the weight of the binoculars in my hands, like I was suddenly seeing things through some kind of hyper-realistic lens. My grip tightened on the radio's microphone as I got ready to report what I was seeing. But I hesitated for a second, doubting myself. Was I just seeing things? But no, when I looked again, the figures were still there. There was no denying it. I pressed the button on the radio, and it crackled to life. My voice came out with this urgency that hadn't been there before. Up until this point, my days in the lookout had been nothing but peaceful. My biggest worry was spotting a wisp of smoke or reporting the occasional lost hiker. But now, these figures, they added this whole new level of tension and unpredictability to the job. I started grappling with questions I'd never even considered before. Was I really alone out here? What were these figures? And why were they just standing there at the edge of the forest? Base, this is Tower 6, do you copy? The radio crackled again, and then I heard my supervisor, Mike's, voice. This is Base, go ahead, Tower 6. I'm seeing some figures at the edge of the forest, standing still, not animals. They look human, or at least humanoid, overcome. There was a brief pause before Mike responded. Alex, You're probably just seeing some wildlife or shadows playing tricks on you. Don't worry about it, over." The dismissal in his voice was obvious, but those figures were still there when I looked again. "Are you sure, Mike? These are different. They're definitely not animals." Mike's voice had a hint of irritation this time. "Alex, it's your first week. You're not used to the woods yet. Things can look weird, especially when you're isolated. Keep your focus on spotting fires." Over. And that was it. Conversation over. I put down the radio, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I was seeing was real. I wrote down the time and location of the sighting in my logbook, just in case. After reporting the sighting, I tried to get back to my daily routine, but it was hard to focus. I kept glancing towards the edge of the forest, half expecting the figures to have moved closer. I decided to busy myself with some maintenance work to try and take my mind off things. I swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and even organized the canned food in the pantry by type and expiration date. As I was rearranging the cans, I also took stock of my supplies. I counted the water bottles, batteries, and first aid items. It suddenly seemed way more important to know exactly what resources I had. The afternoon dragged on, and it was time for another sweep of the forest. I picked up my binoculars, hesitating for a moment before looking. When I finally focused on the edge of the forest, the figures were gone. I felt this mix of relief and unease. Had they retreated, or had they just moved to a spot where I couldn't see them? My radio crackled to life, interrupting my thoughts. It was time for the evening check-in. I reported that everything was normal, even though it really didn't feel that way. The base signed off without any more questions, and I was alone again. As the sun started to set, I heated up some canned soup for dinner. I ate slowly, my eyes drifting towards the windows more often than my food. When I finished eating, I decided it was best to lock up for the night. I secured the tower door and double-checked the windows. Normally, these tasks felt routine, but tonight they felt absolutely necessary. I sat down with a book, trying to relax, but the words on the page just didn't register. My mind kept drifting back to those shadowy figures and all the unknowns they brought into my solitary existence. Finally, I put the book down and decided to turn in for the night. I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of the wind through the trees, seemed amplified. The next day started like any other. I woke up, made my coffee, and headed up to the observation deck. The forest felt even more endless today, maybe because of the worry I was still carrying from yesterday's strange sighting. I grabbed my binoculars and began my routine scan of the trees. The morning light broke through the foliage, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground below. Then there they were again. This time, they were closer than before, standing within a small clearing that was no more than 200 yards from the tower. As I focused my binoculars, I could make out more details. They appeared humanoid, but were covered in what looked like dark, tattered clothing. Their features were obscured as if they were wrapped in shadow. Despite the morning light, their forms were irregular, shifting, almost like the static on an old television screen. There was a distortion about them that made it hard to focus on any specific features. It was like my eyes slid off them, refusing to lock on. Gathering my thoughts, I reached for the radio microphone, hesitating for a moment before pressing the transmit button. "Tower 4, this is Tower 6, do you copy?" I tried to keep my voice steady, disguising the nervous energy that was buzzing inside me. The radio crackled, And then a familiar voice came through. "This is Tower 4, I read you Tower 6. What's going on?" It was Ben, a guy I'd talked to a few times during check-ins. I paused, considering how to word this. "Have you seen anything unusual out there lately? Specifically, shadowy figures at the edge of the forest." The line went silent for a few seconds before Ben responded. "Shadowy figures? You mean like animals? I've seen a couple of deer and a bear, but no shadowy figures. Why? What are you seeing?" I exhaled deeply, a little relieved but also feeling more isolated by his response. "I've seen them for 2 days now. They're not animals. They're humanoid, standing at the edge of the forest yesterday, but closer today. About 200 yards from my tower. They're just standing there, watching." Another pause on the line, longer this time. "You sure you're not just seeing things? It can get pretty lonely out there, you know. Minds play tricks." I gripped the microphone tightly. "I'm not imagining it. I thought so too, at first. But they're there. Today they're even closer. They don't look like people, not exactly, but they're definitely not animals. They're covered in some kind of dark, tattered clothing, and their features are all blurry, like they're made of static or something." Another pause. This time, when Ben spoke, his voice had a different tone, one I couldn't quite place. "Well, I haven't seen anything like that, but I'll keep an eye out. Just stay safe, okay? Maybe keep the door locked." "All right, I will," I replied, setting down the microphone. His words offered little comfort. In fact, they somehow made me feel more alone, the weight of what I was experiencing settling a bit heavier on my shoulders. The next morning, I woke up with this sense of apprehension I just couldn't shake. I couldn't get the conversations and the sightings from the past couple of days out of my head. After brewing my coffee, I climbed up to the observation deck, almost reluctant to pick up the binoculars. When I finally did, my hands were trembling slightly. I immediately looked toward that small clearing where the figures had been yesterday, 200 yards away. My eyes scanned the area, but there was nothing there. For a moment, relief washed over me. But then, a sudden realization hit me. I hadn't checked the other areas, the areas closer to the tower. My hands moved almost involuntarily, steering the binoculars to scan the surrounding terrain. And there they were. The shadowy figures had moved. Now they were just 100 yards away, closer to one of the footpaths that led toward the tower. They were half hidden by the trees, but definitely nearer. My heart raced as I fumbled for the radio microphone. My fingers pressed the button more hastily than before. "Tower 4, this is Tower 6, do you copy?" There was an urgency in my voice that I couldn't suppress. "Tower 6, this is Tower 4. What's the situation?" The voice crackled through the speaker. Thieves moved again, closer this time, just 100 yards away, and near one of the footpaths, I said, trying to keep my voice steady but failing. There was a pause, and the tone that came back was serious and concerned. "Are you sure it's not some hikers or hunters?" "I'm sure," I replied. "These aren't people, at least not any kind of people I recognize. They're closer, and it feels deliberate." "All right, keep your eyes peeled and stay inside after dark. Lock up, and keep a weapon close if you have one," Ben advised. "Will do," I responded, placing the microphone back on its holder. As I looked out over the forest, the shadowy figures seemed to blend in and out of the trees. The curiosity and unease were eating away at me. Just sitting up here, looking through binoculars, didn't seem like enough anymore. I needed to be more proactive, to try to make some sense of what I was seeing. I grabbed the topographic map of the forest area that was stashed in one of the drawers. It was detailed, showing elevation, trails, water bodies, and other landmarks. Using a red marker, I started placing X on the map, each one representing the approximate location where I'd spotted the figures. As I stepped back to get a better view, I hoped that a pattern would emerge, something that would give me a clue as to what these figures might be. Were they following a trail? Were they near water sources? Close to an old, abandoned campsite, perhaps? My eyes darted from one red X to another, but no pattern was evident. Each night, the figures drew unsettlingly closer to my tower. I felt like I couldn't handle this on my own any longer. Feeling desperate for some sort of validation or advice, I grabbed my radio and tuned into Tower 3, where my colleague Sarah worked. "This is Alex from Tower 6. Have you ever witnessed anything strange out there? I mean, shadowy figures that seem to be coming closer to the tower each day." There was a pause, a few seconds of silence that felt like an eternity. Finally, Sarah replied, "I've never seen anything like that. It sounds creepy. Are you sure it's not just the loneliness playing tricks on your mind? Have you been getting enough sleep?" I gripped the radio tighter, frustrated but also relieved to be talking to someone. "I know what I saw. I'm not making this up. There's something out there, and whatever it is, it's getting nearer to my tower every single day. I have no idea what to make of it." Just as I heard Sarah key up her radio to respond, the connection died. The radio went dead, no static, no interference, just an eerie stillness. My heart skipped a beat. I tapped the microphone, turned the frequency dial back and forth, and even gave the radio a couple of frustrated smacks, hoping to jolt it back to life. Nothing worked. The dead radio intensified the isolation tenfold. It was like being cut off from the world by an invisible hand, left to fend for myself with this inexplicable phenomenon slowly encroaching upon me. Now I was truly alone. With the radio dead, I couldn't warn anyone, couldn't ask for help. Night descended on the forest, and the darkness felt more oppressive than ever. I could sense the weight of the evening settling on around me like a thick blanket, tightening with each passing minute. Gripping my binoculars, I hesitantly scanned the forest below, almost afraid of what I might see. The sinking feeling in my stomach turned into a pit of dread as I found what I was looking for. The figures. They weren't just closer. They were almost right underneath me, nearly at the base of my tower. A shiver crawled up my spine, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. The gravity of the situation hit me hard as I placed the binoculars back on the table. This was no longer a distant curiosity or a vague fret. This was, well, it was terrifying. I started to feel cornered, my options dwindling as the figures drew nearer. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, the risk was now immediate and terrifyingly real. I rushed to take stock of what I had to defend myself: a flashlight with dimming batteries, a basic fire extinguisher, and a flare gun with a single flare. No real weapons, nothing that would be considered reliable for self-defense. My eyes darted to the furniture, the chair, the table, the shelves. In a burst of anxious energy, I moved them in front of the entrance, barricading myself in as best as I could. It was a feeble barrier, I knew, but it was all I had. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, waiting, listening for any sound that might indicate what was coming next. All I heard was the wind rustling through the trees, and my own breath, quick and shallow. Time stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity, as I contemplated what the figures might do and how I could possibly respond with my limited resources. The minutes ticked on, each one stretching into what felt like an hour. The tower creaked, the leaves rustled, and each sound drove my pulse higher. I felt like a cornered animal, eyes darting to the barricaded door over and over again. I half expected it to be flung open, revealing whatever awaited me outside. But that moment didn't come. I could hear my own shallow breaths filling the room, mixing with the sound of my growing anxiety. Gathering my courage, I reached for the binoculars again, my hands trembling as I lifted them to my eyes. I looked down to the base of the tower, half hoping, half dreading what I'd see. The figures were still there, as stationary as before. They hadn't advanced, but they hadn't retreated either. They seemed to be waiting. It was as if they were waiting for a specific moment or a sign. The standoff continued, with neither side making a move, and I was left to grapple with the unnerving uncertainty of it all. The tension was unbearable. My mind raced through different scenarios. What did they want? Why were they here? Why haven't they moved? These questions circled in my head, but there were no answers. As the first rays of dawn cut through the darkness, I watched through my binoculars as the figures began to retreat. They moved back into the forest, blending in with the trees until they were swallowed up by the morning mist. Even though the sunlight should have signified safety and warmth, I felt none of it. The chill inside me persisted. I sat back in my chair, trying to collect my thoughts but finding it difficult. My mind was a whirlpool of questions that looped back on themselves, offering no escape or answers. The day dragged on, each hour stretching out as I went through the motions of my duties. I maintained the tower, swept the floors, and ate canned food, but it all felt robotic, almost meaningless in the face of the uncertainty that awaited me. Several times, I picked up the radio and tinkered with it, in a futile attempt to get it working again. But it remained stubbornly silent. The absence of human contact, even just a voice over the radio, felt like a gaping hole in my reality, amplifying my sense of isolation. As the afternoon waned, I found myself glancing more frequently at the descending sun. The bright sky gradually darkened into hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The beauty of the sunset was lost on me today. Instead, its fading light only served as a reminder that another night was approaching. Another night with the figures. Another night of not knowing what would happen when the world outside my tower plunged into darkness. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the sun finally set, surrendering the world to the impending night. The night sky was darker than usual, like a blanket of darkness had been thrown over the forest. There was no moon tonight, and the stars were hiding, making everything look like a vast void. My eyes had adjusted just enough to see the figures at the base of the tower. They were circling around, staying just out of the range of clear vision. They were close enough to make out, but far enough to keep me guessing. My hand rested on the flare gun next to me on the table. Thoughts rushed through my mind, each one grappling with a dilemma. Should I fire the flare gun? Would it drive them away, or would it provoke something I wasn't prepared to handle? Suddenly, my ears picked up a noise that stood out from the background sounds of the forest. It was coming from directly below, at the base of the tower. This wasn't just the wind or some animal passing through. It was a consistent scratching noise. My heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. Whatever was making that sound was not just wandering around, it was trying to ascend the tower. The realization filled me with a mixture of fear and urgency. Reacting more out of instinct than reasoned thought, I stood up abruptly, the flare gun in my hand. I took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, aimed the gun skyward, and pulled the trigger. The flare soared high, cutting through the darkness. For a brief moment, The forest was illuminated in an eerie red glow, like a scene from some apocalyptic landscape. As the flare ascended, the scratching sound stopped. The figures recoiled, retreating into the darkness beyond the trees. For a split second, the world was silent, save for the sound of the flare as it reached the peak of its ascent. It was a momentary victory, but even as the flare began its descent, illuminating a smaller and smaller portion of the forest, the weight of my decision began to sink in. Had I just warded off danger, or had I escalated a situation I didn't fully understand? I was left with an uneasy feeling, standing in the red glow of the descending flare, pondering the implications of my choice. Suddenly, I noticed the flare's fiery tail ignite a cluster of dry leaves on the ground. My heart sank as I saw a small fire begin to spread. I snapped into action, grabbing the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. I rushed down the stairs, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My hands worked almost on autopilot to remove the barricades I had set up at the entrance. Ignoring the voice in my head warning me of the dangers outside, I threw open the door and raced down the stairs that wrapped around the tower. My feet pounded the ground as I sprinted towards the small fire. The fire extinguisher felt heavy but manageable as I pulled the pin and aimed it at the base of the flames. With a squeeze of the trigger, the extinguisher discharged, covering the flames in a cloud of foam. The fire sputtered, crackled, and then died, replaced by a cloud of smoke that slowly began to disperse. As the smoke cleared, the gravity of what I'd just done set in. I'd extinguished the fire, yes, but I'd also stepped out of the safety of the tower. My eyes darted around the forest, scanning the darkness for any sign of the shadowy figures. Nothing. They were gone, as if swallowed up by the night itself. While this could have been a relief, it wasn't. It intensified the knot of dread in my stomach. Where did they go? Why hadn't they seized the opportunity to approach me when I was most vulnerable? Their absence, rather than reassuring me, raised more unsettling questions. Clutching the now empty fire extinguisher, I hurried back to the tower. Every sound, every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. My nerves were frayed as I locked the door behind me, quickly restoring the barricade with shaky hands. The flare gun lay where I'd left it, and I gripped it tightly, hoping it would provide some sense of comfort. Looking out through the window, the figures were still nowhere to be seen, but that didn't alleviate the weight of unease that had settled over me. They were out there. I knew they were. I sat there, flare gun in hand, pondering these troubling thoughts. After a couple of hours, the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the trees and filling the sky with shades of orange and pink. Just as the dawn broke, the radio crackled back to life. A voice burst through the static, clear as day. "Tower 6, this is base. Do you copy?" "I copy," I responded, touching the radio microphone. "You won't believe what happened here last night. I saw those figures again, but they were closer, right at the base of the tower." And the radio went dead. "Slow down, Alex. Start from the beginning," they said. I recounted everything: the figures, the scratching at the base, the flare gun, and the fire. I had to put the fire out myself. The fire extinguisher is empty, and there's a burned area in the forest. "We're sending a rescue team. Sit tight," the voice on the radio confirmed. Within a couple of hours, I heard the distant rumble of an engine growing steadily louder. A sense of relief washed over me as a vehicle finally pulled up near the tower. The rescue team poured out, inspecting the tower and the area around it. When they got to me, I saw their faces change. They could see I was visibly shaken. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. "I've been better," I replied, forcing a weak smile. They found the markings at the base of the tower, exactly where I'd heard the scratching. Claw marks were etched into the wood, confirming that something did try to climb up. They also found the charred remnants of the flare and the extinguished area of the fire. Despite all of this, skepticism clouded their faces as they looked over the evidence. Should be raccoons, or maybe another kind of animal, one team member suggested, examining the claw marks. You think a raccoon fired a flare gun and started a fire? I snapped, frustrated by their disbelief. It's more likely that you're suffering from isolation and stress. Another team member chimed in. These jobs can get to you, especially when you're out here alone. But I know what I saw, I insisted. These weren't animals. They were human-shaped, tall figures just standing there, and they were getting closer each night. Look, Alex, we all get a little stir-crazy out here. It's normal. You said yourself the radio was out. You were cut off, isolated. Maybe your mind was playing tricks on you. The team leader offered, not unkindly. I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear they weren't taking my claims seriously, dismissing my experience as the product of isolation and perhaps even paranoia. As I climbed into the rescue vehicle, my feelings were complicated. On one hand, relief flooded over me. I was finally getting out of this isolated place. On the other hand, frustration boiled within me like a kettle on a stove. Despite the markings, the charred remnants, and my earnest recounting, they didn't believe me. They attributed my experience to isolation or even paranoia, and that lack of validation infuriated me. The engine roared to life, and we started to pull away. I glanced back at the tower as its wooden frame became smaller in the distance. As the vehicle navigated through the uneven forest road, I couldn't help but think about what was left behind the tower, the markings, the unknown figures. These weren't just figments of my imagination, they were real. My mind kept replaying the events, and I couldn't escape the nagging thought that maybe the forest was harboring something that it shouldn't, something inexplicable and unnerving that defied logic and understanding. That feeling stuck with me as we continued to drive away. Years have passed, and the memory of those unexplained figures still haunts me. After much internal debate, I finally decided it was time to visit the tower once more. As I drove toward the forest, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. I parked my car at the edge of the tree line and took a deep breath, steeling myself before I started the familiar hike to the tower. Reaching the base of the tower, it appeared almost exactly as I remembered it, except for the overgrown vines crawling up its sides. No one has used this tower in years, as they stopped using it many years ago. I placed my hand on the wooden railing and started ascending the stairs of the tower. The steps creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that took me back in time. I could feel the years of disuse in the worn wood, the air thick with dust and lingering memories. As I climbed higher, I remembered the countless times I'd made this same journey, always with a sense of duty, but never with the apprehension I felt now. Reaching the landing just before the top, I paused for a moment. This was it, the last few steps that led to the observation room. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I climbed the remaining stairs and found myself standing in front of the closed door. The paint was peeling, and the metal handle was tarnished, but it was just as I remembered it. My hand hesitated over the doorknob. Finally, mustering the courage, I grasped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. As I stepped inside, it was like walking into a time capsule. The same wooden table, the same chairs, even the same old radio set that once connected me to the outside world. A thick layer of dust covered everything, giving the room an air of abandonment. But despite this, it felt like coming back to an old chapter of my life, one that I'd closed but never really forgot. I walked over to the window with my binoculars and looked out, bracing myself for what I might see. But for now, the forest below was calm, almost serene. It gave me no answers, only a reflection of the mysteries I'd lived. My gaze scanned over the area where I'd most often seen those elusive figures. Nothing unusual caught my eye, just the typical sea of green. I was about to turn away when, in the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. Dark shapes lurking in the depths of the forest. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly turned the binoculars toward where I thought I saw them. But there was nothing there now. I scanned the area intensely, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Did I really see them, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Either way, I decided it was time to go. I put down the binoculars and took one last look at the forest below. Real or not, the figures remained a mystery, a chapter in my life that refused closure. With a heavy heart, I left the observation room, closed the door behind me, and made my way down the tower stairs. I started my walk back to the car. The forest was serene, but the unease still sat heavy in my stomach. As I drove away, the tower grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it was swallowed entirely by the forest. Though years have passed, the experience remains etched in my memory. No one ever believed my story, dismissing it as a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw and what I felt.